The bells of Kingston rang out on Easter Sunday, their iron mouths echoing across the harbor as families in pressed linens made their way to church. The air smelled of salt, sugarcane, and wood smoke, the familiar scent of a bustling port city still chained to Britain's empire. For the white families who dominated the island, Easter was a holy day, a chance to display piety while parading wealth in bonnets and tailcoats. The holiday promised feasting, prayer, and the reaffirmation of a social order they believed eternal. But inside one grand colonial mansion, tucked behind iron gates and shaded by towering palms, the stage was set for a scene that would rupture the illusion of peace and expose the festering violence at the heart of Jamaica's slave society. Her name was Sarah. Few knew her story, fewer still remembered her voice. She was one of thousands of enslaved women who moved silently through the households of Kingston's elite, carrying trays of food, polishing silver, washing linen stiff with sweat. She was expected to be invisible, her body and labor consumed by a system that reduced her to property. But on this Easter Sunday, Sarah was not invisible. She was a storm contained within a frame of flesh and bone, a woman who had endured too much, seen too much, and whose rage was about to ignite. The morning had begun like countless others. The mistress of the house prepared for services, her gown pressed, her hair powdered, her mind perhaps already on the banquet to follow. Servants moved briskly through corridors, laying out dishes, airing the parlor, making sure every detail reflected the refinement of colonial life. Sarah had been tasked with her usual duties, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps attending her mistress directly, but her thoughts were not on service. They were on liberation, on fire, on blood. Somewhere in the house lay the tool she needed, heavy and cold, its blade worn sharp from splitting wood. An axe, a simple object of labor, about to become the instrument of rupture. Accounts from that day vary in detail, but what is certain is this: Sarah struck. She did not whisper, did not warn, did not plead. She lifted the axe and brought it down upon the woman who claimed to own her, steel meeting bone in a terrible instant. The sound must have been sickening, an Easter hymn drowned out by a scream cut short. Blood stained the polished floorboards, splattered against a dress meant to impress fellow churchgoers. The mistress, who moments earlier embodied the serene confidence of authority, now lay broken at the feet of the woman she had treated as less than human. But Sarah was not finished. The violence was not a single act, not just the swing of a blade. It was a declaration, and declarations demand fire. She moved through the mansion with purpose, kindling catching on curtains, flames licking at oil lamps and draperies. The opulence of colonial wealth, fine furniture imported from Europe, silks and lace purchased with sugar profits, became fuel for an inferno. Within minutes, smoke poured from the windows, black against the tropical sky, a signal visible for miles. Passers-by on their way to church turned their heads, horrified. Some ran toward the mansion, others froze, whispering rumors of slave uprisings, of vengeance, of doom. For the enslaved people who witnessed the flames, the moment must have been complicated. Fear, yes, for punishment was certain to follow, but also awe. A woman who had been denied all power had struck at the very heart of power itself. In a society where enslaved people were whipped for speaking out of turn, Sarah had taken an axe to her mistress and reduced her grand house to cinders. For a fleeting moment, the unthinkable had become real. The mighty brought low, the enslaver consumed by the same fire she had stoked in others' lives. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection, of triumph over death, had been turned upside down. For the white residents of Kingston, who rushed to the burning mansion, it must have seemed like blasphemy, an assault not only on property and life, but on the sacred order of their world. The holiday meant salvation, and yet here was damnation in the form of an enslaved woman's rebellion. Smoke curled into the sky like an accusation, like a reminder that beneath the polite hymns and perfumed gowns lay centuries of brutality that could not remain buried forever. Sarah was captured soon after. The fire may have spread quickly, but the colonial machine moved quicker when its own survival was at stake. Soldiers, constables, and neighbors surged toward the chaos, seizing her, dragging her through streets where the smell of charred wood lingered. But in that brief, searing act, Sarah had already altered the landscape of fear and control. Her name would become a whisper among planters, another justification for harsher discipline, another story told to terrify others into submission. Yet for those who carried chains, her defiance was a spark, fleeting but unforgettable. As the embers cooled and Easter bells tolled again, the city of Kingston returned to its rituals, but the illusion of calm had cracked. Behind the facade of colonial grandeur was the undeniable truth. Slavery was a war, fought not only in organized rebellions, but in moments of sudden, desperate violence. Sarah of Kingston was one woman among thousands, but in her hands an axe became more than a weapon. It became a symbol, a reminder that even in the most controlled environment, resistance could erupt without warning. Why did she do it? Was it revenge for a particular cruelty, or the culmination of years of degradation? Was the timing deliberate, a mockery of the holiday, or coincidence born of opportunity? History does not tell us. The records reduce her to a name, a crime, a sentence. But the silence around her motivations speaks louder than the official accounts. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of explanation. Their stories were told by those who profited from their suffering. Yet the violence of Sarah's act, carried out in the heart of the empire's richest colony, forces us to confront questions that linger like the scent of smoke long after the fire has died. On that Easter Sunday in Kingston, while congregations sang of resurrection and eternal life, Sarah delivered a different kind of sermon. Her gospel was written in blood and flame, a testimony of rage and despair, a warning that no system built on chains could ever be entirely secure. The mansion was reduced to ash, the mistress reduced to memory, and Sarah reduced to a criminal in the colonial record. But the echoes of that day carry forward, asking us to look deeper, not just at her act, but at the world that made it inevitable. Kingston did not sleep easily after the Easter fire. The city's merchants, officials, and planters carried on their routines, but behind the polished shopfronts and crowded wharves lingered an unease that words could barely capture. The story of Sarah's act spread quickly, whispered first in shocked tones by neighbors, and then etched into colonial records as a cautionary tale. To understand why her violence struck such terror into the heart of Jamaica's ruling class, we must step back and examine the world that shaped her, a world of wealth built on human suffering, of prosperity that demanded perpetual blood. In the early 19th century, Jamaica was the crown jewel of Britain's sugar empire. The island glittered in the imagination of London financiers and plantation owners, its cane fields described as white gold under the Caribbean sun. Ships docked in Kingston Harbor laden with sugar, molasses, and rum, commodities that sweetened tea in English parlors and lined the coffers of aristocrats. Yet the beauty of Kingston's Georgian houses and bustling markets was a mask. Beneath it lay an empire sustained by forced labor, where hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans and their descendants worked under conditions that defy comprehension. The plantation economy was unrelenting. Sugar was not merely a crop, but an obsession, one that demanded endless cycles of planting, cutting, grinding, and boiling. Enslaved men and women worked from before dawn until after dusk, their bodies driven by overseers' whips. Heat blistered their skin, cane knives sliced their hands, and the great boiling houses filled with scalding syrup claimed lives in gruesome accidents. Those who faltered were punished mercilessly. Colonial law allowed for whipping, mutilation, even execution, often carried out in public to instill fear. Kingston itself, though less tied to field labor than the countryside, was no refuge. Urban slavery meant running errands, hauling goods, and endless domestic service, all while subject to constant surveillance. Women like Sarah carried a unique burden. They labored in kitchens thick with smoke, washed heavy linens, and raised children who were not their own. Some were forced into sexual servitude, their bodies treated as extensions of property. Pregnancy offered no reprieve. Women returned to work within days of childbirth, their infants often left unattended or entrusted to older enslaved children. In plantation records, enslaved women were listed alongside livestock, valued for both their labor and their ability to bear more laborers. Their suffering was compounded by the intimacy of domestic service, the constant proximity to mistresses and masters, the daily indignities of being ordered, slapped, or insulted, all while expected to smile and obey. This was the world Sarah inhabited, a system that thrived on the erasure of individuality. Few enslaved people left behind their own words, their own accounts. Instead, their lives appear in court records, plantation ledgers, and travelers' diaries, documents written by those who exploited them. We do not know if Sarah had children, or if she lost them to sale or disease, both common fates. We do not know if she endured sexual violence, as countless enslaved women did, or if her act of killing was aimed at a mistress who inflicted daily torment. What we do know is that women in her position lived under a constant strain, their humanity denied, their silence enforced. Religion added another layer to the tension. For white Jamaicans, Easter was a celebration of divine order, of Christ's sacrifice affirming their place atop the colonial hierarchy. They filled Kingston's churches, dressed in their finery, convinced that their wealth was evidence of God's blessing. Enslaved people, however, often found in Christianity both a weapon of control and a seed of rebellion. Missionaries taught obedience and humility, urging slaves to accept their lot in life as divinely ordained. Yet the story of Exodus, of liberation from bondage, whispered another message. The hymns of suffering and resurrection could be interpreted as promises not to the masters, but to the enslaved themselves. Sarah's act on Easter Sunday inverted the symbolism entirely. Instead of resurrection, there was destruction. Instead of peace, fire. Fear of rebellion haunted Jamaica constantly. The memory of Haiti's revolution, where enslaved people had risen up and overthrown the French, loomed over every planter's mind like a specter. Stories of poisonings, arson, and violent uprisings circulated through colonial newspapers, feeding paranoia. In Kingston, with its dense population of enslaved people and free people of color, white families lived with a nagging sense of vulnerability. Their homes were staffed by those who might one day turn against them, their wealth guarded by those who had every reason to hate them. Sarah's attack seemed to confirm their darkest fears, that danger did not come only from distant plantations or organized revolts, but from within their own walls. Yet for the enslaved community, Kingston was also a site of survival and subtle resistance. Enslaved men and women forged kinship networks, bartered in markets, practiced African traditions under the watchful eyes of authorities. They found ways to carve out humanity in a world determined to deny it. Stories and songs preserved fragments of heritage, quiet acts of defiance, slowing work, feigning illness, breaking tools, challenged the absolute authority of masters. And sometimes, as in Sarah's case, resistance erupted violently, leaving scars that could not be ignored. It is tempting for modern readers to view Sarah's act as sudden madness, a burst of inexplicable brutality. But seen against the backdrop of early 19th century Kingston, it becomes something else, the logical outcome of a world where violence was the foundation of every interaction. If whippings, brandings, and executions were routine tools of discipline, why should the enslaved not strike back with the same ferocity? If homes were built on stolen labor, why should they not burn? Sarah's axe was not just an instrument of murder, but a mirror held up to the society around her. When we picture Kingston during those years, we should not imagine only the bustling harbor or elegant churches. We must also imagine the cramped slave quarters, the sweat-soaked kitchens, the auction blocks where families were torn apart. We must imagine the constant surveillance, the looming gallows, the sound of the whip cutting through flesh. This was Sarah's world, a city that celebrated Easter with hymns while tolerating human bondage, a place where the wealthiest households depended on the quiet suffering of women like her. By situating her act within this broader context, we begin to see its meaning. Sarah was not merely a criminal who disrupted a holy day. She was a product of Kingston's contradictions, its glittering facade and its hidden horrors, its claims to Christian virtue and its daily practices of cruelty. To the white population, she was a nightmare come true. To history, she remains a figure caught between silence and defiance, her story a testament to the unbearable weight of a system that demanded obedience but sowed rebellion. Sarah's story is like a shadow moving through the cracks of history, visible for only a moment in the blaze of her crime, then swallowed again by silence. To reconstruct her life, we are forced to read between the lines of court records, to imagine the rhythms of her days, and to place her within the cruel patterns that define the lives of enslaved women in Kingston. Though the archives reduce her to a name and a violent act, behind that silence was a human being with a history, with emotions, with quiet moments that carried her toward the eruption of Easter Sunday. It is possible that Sarah was born in Jamaica, the child of African parents who had survived the Atlantic crossing. Or perhaps she herself endured the Middle Passage, ripped from her homeland as a teenager, shackled in the dark hold of a ship bound for the Caribbean. Each possibility carried its own scars. For the Creole, enslaved, those born on the island, life meant growing up under constant surveillance, learning from infancy that their bodies were not their own. For the saltwater Africans, the trauma of dislocation was added to the brutality of plantation life. Memories of homelands, languages, and kin networks severed in an instant. Whether native-born or imported, Sarah would have learned quickly that survival demanded silence, obedience, and resilience. As a domestic servant, Sarah lived in the strange liminal space between privilege and oppression. Compared to those who labored in the cane fields under the punishing sun, household slaves were considered fortunate. They wore hand-me-down gowns, ate leftovers from the family table, and sometimes slept under a roof rather than in crude huts. But this proximity to their masters meant constant exposure to humiliation. In the intimacy of the household, there was no space to retreat, no chance to hide. Every action was scrutinized, every mistake punished. A plate dropped, a dish underseasoned, a child left unattended. All could bring a slap, a lash, or worse. Psychologists who study slavery describe a condition sometimes called double consciousness under bondage. Enslaved people had to wear a mask of obedience, eyes lowered, voices soft, while inside them brewed feelings of rage, grief, and longing. For women like Sarah, this mask was worn daily in the presence of mistresses who demanded servility while reminding them constantly of their inferiority. Imagine the daily ritual: Sarah rising before dawn, fetching water, ironing gowns, brushing her mistress's hair, adjusting jewels, only to be dismissed with insults or blows. Each act reinforced the hierarchy. Each act demanded the erasure of her own will. But masks crack eventually. Enslaved women in Jamaica were often described by planters as troublesome, a word that reveals far more about the oppressors than the oppressed. Resistance took many forms: refusing food, feigning illness, whispering curses under breath, or practicing obeah, the African-derived spiritual system the British feared as sorcery. Some women used poison to strike at masters and mistresses. Others fought back with fists, knives, or boiling water. In Sarah's case, her weapon was an axe. But long before that Easter Sunday, she must have carried the slow, corrosive burn of resentment. We can imagine Sarah's personal losses, though the documents do not record them. Perhaps she bore children who were taken from her and sold. Perhaps she saw companions whipped to death or branded for minor infractions. Perhaps she was assaulted by those who claimed ownership over her body. Enslaved women endured a violence that was not only physical but intimate, a daily violation of dignity. These experiences were not exceptional, they were the norm. Within such a context, the idea that Sarah one day snapped ceases to be shocking. What becomes shocking is that so many others bore the same torment in silence. But silence is deceptive. Behind the outward calm of the enslaved community pulsed a hidden world of thought and feeling. Oral histories from other Caribbean colonies tell of women who nurtured quiet hatred for decades, who bided their time waiting for the right moment to resist. Many of these stories never reached the written page, but they lived in whispers passed down through generations. Sarah's eruption of violence may have been one such long-nurtured flame. Unexpected to her mistress, perhaps, but long in the making within her own heart. There is also the question of religion and psychology. Easter, for Sarah, may not have carried the same meaning it did for her mistress. To her oppressors, it was a sacred holiday of salvation. But to Sarah, it may have felt like another layer of hypocrisy, another day when the people who whipped and degraded her paraded themselves as pious Christians. The contrast must have been infuriating. To watch her mistress don silks for church while Sarah remained in the shadows, dirty, exhausted, denied humanity, was to see faith twisted into a tool of control. Perhaps this dissonance sharpened her resolve. The axe and the fire may have been not only vengeance, but a rejection of a religion that sanctified her suffering. The psychology of enslaved women often reveals a pattern: endurance until the breaking point. They lived lives of unbearable restraint, forced to swallow anger, forced to obey, forced to smile. But every restraint has a limit. The pressure builds silently, day after day, until one act, seemingly sudden to outsiders, becomes inevitable. Sarah's sudden violence was likely the culmination of years, even decades, of accumulated rage. In that sense, her life can be seen as a vessel filled drop by drop until it overflowed in blood and fire. There is tragedy in the gaps of Sarah's story. We cannot know the sound of her voice, the details of her dreams, the precise words exchanged on the morning of the crime. History denies her the dignity of personal testimony, but we can see her silhouette in the broader patterns of enslaved women's lives. We can feel her presence in the testimonies of others who endured similar fates, whose stories were recorded by missionaries, planters, and abolitionists. And we can recognize in her actions the ultimate expression of a truth often buried, that enslaved women, no matter how silenced, carried within them the capacity for defiance, and when it came, it shook the foundations of empire. By piecing together her context, her probable experiences, and her psychological burden, we move closer to understanding the storm that erupted in Kingston that Easter. Sarah was not merely a servant who went mad. She was a woman shaped by a system of constant violation, a woman whose life was marked by loss and humiliation, a woman who endured long enough to decide that obedience had to end. Her act was not random. It was the climax of a life lived in chains. And in that realization, we begin to see her not only as an isolated figure of violence, but as a symbol of the countless silent women whose fury remained hidden, who dreamed of the same fire but never had the chance to strike the match. The morning light of Easter Sunday filtered through the shutters of the mansion, carrying with it the humid promise of another sweltering Caribbean day. Outside, the streets of Kingston stirred with activity. Carriages clattering over cobblestones, children darting between market stalls, the sound of bells pulling the faithful toward church. The city seemed to hum with a strange mixture of solemnity and festivity. But inside the home of Sarah's mistress, another kind of ritual was about to unfold, one that bore no resemblance to hymns or prayers, one that would forever mark this holy day with the stain of blood and smoke. Sarah must have risen early, as she always did, her body conditioned by years of routine. Perhaps she moved through the kitchen, the smell of roasting meats and baked breads already filling the air, preparing the feast that would follow the service. She may have polished silver, adjusted table settings, or laid out garments for her mistress. The rhythm of servitude was familiar, and to any onlooker, Sarah would have appeared calm, obedient, another silent figure in the machinery of the household. Yet beneath the surface, the storm that had been gathering for years was reaching its breaking point. An axe lay somewhere in the house or the yard, a tool used for splitting logs for cooking fires. It was not a weapon by design, but a tool of labor, like Sarah herself, instrumental, functional, unnoticed. In her hands, however, it became something else. Whether she had planned the act for days, or whether the decision crystallized in that moment, no one can say. But when she lifted the axe, history bent toward violence. The first blow was sudden and merciless. Steel met flesh, and the household order collapsed in an instant. The mistress, who had dressed for church, who embodied the authority of whiteness and wealth, crumpled under the strike. Imagine the sound, a sharp crack echoing through the chamber, followed by the muffled thud of a body collapsing. For Sarah, the moment must have been both terrifying and liberating. She had crossed an unthinkable threshold, silenced the voice that had commanded her day after day. Blood stained the floorboards, bright against polished wood, soaking into the fibers of the very house that had been built on exploitation. The panic that followed must have been chaotic. Other servants may have screamed, their cries carrying into the street. Children or neighbors may have rushed toward the house, only to be met with the thickening smell of smoke. Because Sarah was not content with the axe alone, her rage demanded fire. Moving swiftly, she set flame to curtains, to furniture, to whatever would burn. Oil lamps became accelerants. Fabric became kindling. Within moments, the house transformed into an inferno. The grand possessions that her mistress prized, the imported silks, the mahogany chairs, the gilded mirrors, were reduced to fragile fuel for destruction. The flames spread hungrily, devouring room after room. Smoke poured from the windows, turning the holiday sky black. Passers-by on their way to church stopped in horror. Some clutched their children, pulling them away from the scene. Others shouted warnings, rushing to form makeshift brigades with buckets of water, though they knew the fire would not be easily contained. To the white elite of Kingston, the sight was apocalyptic. A mansion burning on Easter Sunday, destroyed not by accident, but by the hand of one they had believed docile and controllable. For enslaved onlookers, however, the image carried a different weight. They had seen whippings in public squares, seen men and women branded like cattle, seen families torn apart by sails. But here was something rare, vengeance made visible. A woman who had been forced into silence now commanded fire, a force as unstoppable as the anger of the oppressed. Some may have felt fear, knowing that collective punishment would surely follow. Others may have felt a flicker of pride, even if they dared not show it. For in Sarah's act, they saw the truth revealed, that the structures of power were not invincible. As the fire consumed the house, the symbolism grew impossible to ignore. Easter was meant to be a day of resurrection, a celebration of hope and salvation. Yet here was an act of destruction so profound it mocked the very idea of peace. Instead of Christ's triumph over death, there was the mistress's lifeless body. Instead of resurrection, ash. Instead of a feast, a smoldering ruin. To the enslavers, it was blasphemy. To Sarah, perhaps, it was justice. Witnesses later described the scene in tones of horror. They spoke of the body of the mistress lying broken, of the screams of onlookers, of the relentless crackle of the flames. Colonial newspapers would recount the crime in detail, emphasizing the barbarity of the enslaved woman who dared to kill her mistress on such a sacred day. But in those retellings, Sarah's voice was absent, her motives erased. To the authorities, she was a monster. To history, she remains an enigma. Yet the act itself resists erasure. No matter how the records sought to demonize her, the memory of the axe and the fire lingered. The house eventually collapsed, beams crashing inward as flames devoured them. The smoke rose high into the sky, a signal visible across Kingston, a dark cloud hanging over the city even as church bells continued to ring. The juxtaposition was almost surreal. Congregations singing of life eternal, while only streets away a woman's rebellion turned wealth into cinders. Sarah was apprehended not long after. Accounts suggest she did not flee far. Perhaps she knew there was no escape, that the colonial machine would catch her no matter how far she ran. Perhaps, in the moment, she did not care. Her act had already been completed. The mistress was dead, the house destroyed, the symbol of obedience shattered. For an enslaved woman whose life had been defined by powerlessness, this was power seized in the most direct, irreversible way. The authorities who captured her would not have seen it that way. To them, she was not a woman asserting humanity, but a criminal committing sacrilege. Dragged through the streets, bound in irons, Sarah would have faced the glares of planters and townsfolk, their faces twisted with fear and rage. They saw not just her, but what she represented. The possibility that any servant, any enslaved woman polishing silver or cooking meals, could harbor a hidden fury capable of erupting at any time. The fire smoldered for hours, leaving behind only charred walls and ash. In the days that followed, the ruins became a grim landmark, a reminder of vulnerability. The story of Sarah's act was told and retold, each version tinged with fear. Planters used it as evidence of the savagery of enslaved people, as justification for harsher control. But beneath their condemnations lay an unspoken truth. They were terrified. Because if Sarah could strike down her mistress on Easter Sunday, who was safe? What other silent storms brewed in the hearts of the enslaved? In the years to come, the details of Sarah's crime would blur, folded into the larger tapestry of rebellion and punishment that defined Jamaica's history. Yet the essence of that day remained clear. Easter Sunday in Kingston became not only a day of prayer, but a day haunted by memory. The image of smoke curling into the sky, of a body felled by an axe, of possessions turned to ash. These lingered in the minds of both the oppressors and the oppressed. For one group, it was terror. For the other, it was proof that resistance, however brief, was possible. The inferno of Easter Sunday was more than a single act of murder and arson. It was a revelation, a tearing away of the polite mask that colonial society wore. Behind the hymns, the silks, and the rituals lay a world built on violence, and Sarah's fire forced that truth into the open. As the ashes cooled, as new walls were built, as life in Kingston carried on, the embers of her defiance smoldered still, unseen but unforgettable. When the last embers of the Easter fire died, the city of Kingston was left with more than charred ruins. It was left with fear, raw, palpable, inescapable. For the white elite, the thought that one woman, armed with nothing more than an axe and determination, had turned a holiday morning into a nightmare was unbearable. Rumors spread as quickly as the smoke had risen. Whispers of conspiracies, of hidden plots, of rebellion brewing beneath the surface. If Sarah could kill her mistress and set a mansion aflame, who was to say others would not follow her example? The colonial authorities moved swiftly. The very survival of their world depended on speed and severity. Sarah was captured quickly, though the exact details of her apprehension have blurred with time. Some accounts suggest she was seized not far from the smoldering ruins, her clothing still streaked with soot and ash, perhaps blood on her hands. Others hint she was betrayed by fellow slaves who feared collective punishment. However she was taken, there is no doubt she was dragged into custody in irons, her fate sealed long before the trial began. In early 19th century Jamaica, justice for enslaved people was never justice at all. The colonial courts were instruments of terror, designed to maintain order, to remind the enslaved of their absolute subjugation. Trials of enslaved individuals were swift, perfunctory, and heavily weighted toward conviction. Sarah's would have been no different. In the eyes of the judges, her crime was not merely the murder of a mistress, but an assault on the entire edifice of white authority. To strike down one woman was to symbolically strike at the empire itself. Witnesses were summoned, other servants, neighbors who saw the smoke, perhaps even the enslaved people who lived in the house. Their testimonies painted Sarah as the embodiment of savagery, their words carefully chosen to strip her of humanity. The colonial press amplified this image, warning readers of the danger lurking in their own households. Every line dripped with fear. Here was proof, they claimed, that the enslaved could never be trusted, that vigilance must never falter, that the lash must fall harder and more often. Sarah's defense, if it can be called that, would have been minimal. Enslaved people were not afforded advocates in any true sense. The court did not seek to understand her motives, did not ask about years of abuse or humiliation, did not consider the possibility that her act was born of desperation. Instead, the trial was a performance, a ritual designed to reassure the white population that order would be restored through blood. In the flickering candlelight of the courtroom, surrounded by robed judges and armed guards, Sarah was condemned before she even opened her mouth. The sentence was inevitable, death. Execution was not just punishment, it was spectacle. Colonial law demanded that enslaved people who committed violent acts against whites be made examples of, their deaths staged as warnings. For women who murdered mistresses, the punishment was often hanging, sometimes combined with burning. It is likely that Sarah faced the gallows, her body displayed before a crowd gathered to witness the reassertion of authority. Perhaps she was hanged in the square, her body swinging in the humid air while church bells tolled in grim counterpoint. Perhaps her remains were left on public display, a stark reminder of what awaited any enslaved person who dared defy the order of things. We cannot know what she thought in those final moments. Did she tremble in fear, or did she stand defiant, unrepentant? Did she think of the fire, of the screams, of the sudden silence when the axe struck? Did she regret, or did she find in her impending death a kind of liberation denied to her in life? The records are silent. They give us only the outcome, not the humanity. The spectacle of her punishment, however, would have been imprinted on those who witnessed it. For the white citizens of Kingston, it was reassurance that order had been restored, that their world had not crumbled entirely. For the enslaved, it was another message in a long history of brutality. Resistance would be met with annihilation. Yet even as her body fell limp, the memory of her act could not be erased. Fear and repression may have silenced open discussion, but in whispers and in private thoughts, the story of Sarah's defiance endured. Colonial newspapers reported the case with a tone of righteous fury. They emphasized the audacity of the crime, the sacrilege of its timing, the barbarity of the method. But in doing so, they also revealed their deepest anxieties. Beneath the condemnation was an unspoken admission. Their households, their very way of life, rested on a fragile foundation. One servant, one moment, one weapon could shatter it. Sarah's trial and execution may have restored order on the surface, but they deepened the cracks of paranoia running through the colonial psyche. In the weeks following her death, punishments across Kingston grew harsher. Masters tightened surveillance, increased whippings, and enforced stricter curfews. The city braced against the possibility of more fires, more axes in the dark. Sarah had been extinguished, but the fear she ignited remained alive. The authorities thought they had buried her rebellion with her body, but in reality, they had made her into a symbol, even if unintentionally. To look at her trial today is to see the grotesque imbalance of power. The court presented itself as the embodiment of law, order, and morality, but in truth, it was an extension of the same violence Sarah had resisted. Her axe and her fire were condemned as barbaric, yet the whip, the chain, the gallows were all deemed lawful. The hypocrisy is staggering. Sarah's act was labeled murder. The system's daily practices were labeled civilization. Her death closed one chapter of her story, but it opened another in the wider narrative of Jamaica's resistance. The trial did not end the unrest. It did not erase the memories of the enslaved who watched her punished. If anything, it confirmed what many already knew. Freedom could never be granted by a system built on cruelty. It would have to be taken, no matter the cost. Thus, the Easter Inferno did not end with ashes. It continued in the courtroom, in the gallows, in the whispers that followed. Sarah was silenced, but the legacy of her defiance could not be entirely contained. The colonial authorities believed they had triumphed, but history tells us otherwise. The system itself would not survive another generation. And in that sense, Sarah's trial was not merely the story of one woman's punishment, but a chapter in the slow unraveling of the empire she struck against with an axe and a flame. When Sarah's body was cut down from the gallows, the authorities thought the matter closed. The law had spoken, justice had been served, and the nightmare of Easter Sunday had been safely contained in the past. But fire leaves traces long after the flames are gone. Smoke clings to walls, ash seeps into the earth, and memory lingers in those who breathe it in. Sarah's act did not vanish with her death. It echoed. It lived on in fear, in whispers, and in the imagination of both enslaved and free. For the white elite of Kingston, her violence became another justification for paranoia. Even before Easter Sunday, they had lived in the long shadow of Haiti. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 haunted every planter across the Caribbean like a ghost that refused to rest. The idea that enslaved people could overthrow their masters, seize power, and build a new society was not theoretical. It had already happened. Jamaica, with its immense population of enslaved people, was fertile ground for similar upheaval. Sarah's axe and fire seemed to confirm that rebellion could erupt anywhere, at any time, from the most unexpected quarters. Fear reshaped daily life. Mistresses looked at their servants differently, wondering what thoughts might lie behind lowered eyes. Masters demanded harsher discipline, convinced that severity was the only safeguard against betrayal. Laws tightened, punishments grew crueler, curfews stricter. But fear is a double-edged sword. It kept the enslaved under brutal control, yes, but it also revealed the fragility of the system. The louder the threats, the harsher the punishments, the clearer it became that the masters were afraid. For the enslaved, Sarah's defiance carried another meaning. Her execution may have been intended as a warning, but warnings can inspire as much as they intimidate. To see one woman strike at the very heart of white authority was to witness the unthinkable made real. Even if her act ended in death, it showed that resistance was possible, that the oppressor's body could fall, that the grand mansions could burn. In whispered conversations in slave quarters and marketplaces, her name would have surfaced, not always openly, but enough to keep her story alive. Sarah's act was not an isolated event. Throughout the Caribbean, enslaved women played crucial roles in resistance, though their stories were often overshadowed by the larger rebellions led by men. Women poisoned masters with subtle mixtures slipped into food. They set houses alight under cover of night. They whispered plans, carried messages, and inspired others with their refusal to break. Sarah's crime on Easter Sunday was part of this wider tradition of female resistance. Resistance that weaponized not only brute force, but also the proximity of domestic service. Who better to strike at the heart of the household than the woman who was forced to serve it every day? The symbolism of her act also endured. Easter, the day of resurrection, had been turned into a day of destruction. To the enslaved, this inversion carried its own poetry. Colonial Christianity preached salvation while sanctioning slavery. By choosing that holy day, whether deliberately or by chance, Sarah's fire exposed the hypocrisy at the core of the empire's faith. For one brief moment, the rituals of the powerful were drowned out by the smoke of rebellion. The planters may have rebuilt the mansion, may have scrubbed the blood from the floorboards, may have gone back to their pews on Sunday, but the memory was not so easily erased. Fear of another Sarah lurked in every household. The idea that rebellion might come not in the form of an organized army, but from a single servant with a blade unsettled the confidence of the elite. It was one thing to guard against uprisings in the fields. It was another to wonder whether the woman pouring your tea might one day pour poison instead. This anxiety would intensify in the years that followed. In 1831, less than a decade after Sarah's execution, Jamaica erupted in the largest slave rebellion in its history, the Baptist War. Tens of thousands of enslaved people rose against the planters, burning plantations, destroying crops, demanding freedom. The rebellion was brutally crushed, but it shook the empire to its core and accelerated the push toward emancipation. In that great uprising, the echo of Sarah's Easter fire could still be heard. Her act had not sparked the war, but it foreshadowed it. She was part of the drumbeat of resistance that grew louder and louder until the entire system collapsed. The legacy of women like Sarah is often hidden beneath layers of colonial narrative. History books written in the 19th century described her as a murderess, a cautionary tale of slave savagery. But from another perspective, she was something far more complex, a woman who seized agency in the only way the system allowed, through an act of devastating violence. To ignore that complexity is to accept the categories imposed by her oppressors. To grapple with it is to confront the uncomfortable truth that resistance in such conditions was never clean, never bloodless, never simple. For modern readers, her story forces difficult questions. Was Sarah a villain, a victim, or both? How do we understand an act that was at once horrifying and yet born of a horrifying system? To condemn her violence without acknowledging the violence of slavery itself is to miss the point entirely. Her acts and her fire were reflections of the whips, chains, and torments she had endured. The difference was not in kind, but in direction. And so her legacy lingers in paradox. For the white elite of her time, she was a monster, proof of the danger hidden within every enslaved household. For the enslaved, she was a figure of awe and warning, someone who dared to do what many only dreamed. For history, she is a reminder that resistance takes many forms, some quiet, some explosive, some remembered, many forgotten. Today, standing in Kingston, the city bears little trace of Sarah's name. The mansion she burned is gone, its ashes long scattered, its mistress long buried. But the story survives in fragments, in records written by those who feared her, in whispers that cross generations, in the broader memory of Jamaica's struggle for freedom. Her axe stroke still reverberates, not as a single act of cruelty, but as part of a larger story of defiance. Sarah of Kingston was not the only one, and she was not the last. The echoes of her fire joined the voices of thousands who resisted in their own ways, building toward the day when slavery itself would be consigned to ash. And though her name may never be inscribed on monuments, her act remains a monument of its own, one carved not in stone, but in terror, in memory, and in the unquenchable desire for freedom. The story of Sarah of Kingston ends, as all human stories must, with silence. The gallows cut short her voice, the archives reduced her to fragments, and time buried her name under layers of dust. Yet her fire never truly died. It lingers in the soil of Kingston, in the psyche of a society built on chains, and in the long arc of history that bends toward freedom. Hers is not simply the tale of an enslaved woman who murdered her mistress. It is the tale of a world defined by cruelty, a world where desperation gave birth to defiance, a world that tried to erase its most inconvenient truths but could never quite succeed. When we step back from the details, the axe, the flames, the courtroom, we are left with the deeper paradox that Sarah forces us to confront. History often demands heroes and villains, but Sarah resists such simple categorization. To the colonial elite, she was evil incarnate, a savage who betrayed the household that fed and clothed her. To those who endured the same chains, she was a symbol of courage and consequence, proof that submission was not the only option. To us, looking back through the lens of time, she is something else entirely, a mirror. A mirror reflecting both the brutality of slavery and the uncomfortable truth that resistance is rarely neat, rarely bloodless, rarely easy to reconcile with modern morality. This is why her story matters. It unsettles. It refuses to allow us the comfort of distance. We cannot admire Sarah's act without reckoning with the horror of it. And yet, we cannot condemn her without acknowledging the infinitely greater horror of the system that drove her to it. She reminds us that history is not clean. It is jagged, violent, contradictory. It is filled with people forced to make impossible choices, choices forged in fire. The echoes of Sarah's defiance extend beyond Kingston, beyond Jamaica, beyond the 19th century. They ripple outward into every story of oppression and resistance. Her act reminds us of the countless unnamed who fought back in ways too small or too hidden to record. The whispered prayer, the stolen moment of joy, the quiet refusal to bow completely. It also reminds us of those who fought back in ways too explosive to ignore. The uprisings, the poisonings, the burnings, the rebellions that carved cracks into the walls of empire. Together, these acts became the chorus of resistance that ultimately toppled the institution of slavery itself. And yet, Sarah's legacy also invites us to think about the stories we tell and the ones we silence. For nearly 2 centuries, her name lay buried in court records, mentioned only in passing, stripped of humanity. Colonial historians dismissed her as a footnote, a madwoman consumed by rage. It is only when we look again, when we piece together the fragments, when we read between the lines, that we glimpse the fuller picture, a woman shaped by relentless violence who answered in kind. To recover her story is to give back a measure of the dignity stolen from her. We must also confront what her story says about the society that condemned her. The same world that hanged Sarah considered itself civilized, godly, enlightened. Yet it whipped children, branded men, and raped women with impunity. It called Sarah's acts barbaric, but its own cruelty lawful. That hypocrisy is not confined to the past. Even today, societies justify violence under the guise of order, condemn resistance while excusing oppression. Sarah's story forces us to ask, when does defiance become justice? And when does law become tyranny? Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Sarah's story is that we will never truly know her. We will never hear her speak in her own words. We will never know if she planned her act for weeks, or if it was the sudden breaking of years of silence. We will never know what she dreamed of as a girl, what songs she hummed when she thought no one listened, what fears she carried in the dark. The archive gives us only the outline, never the inner life. But maybe, in some way, that is fitting. Sarah stands not only for herself, but for the millions silenced by the same system. In every gap of her story, we glimpse the countless others whose stories were never written at all. And so, as we close the book on this tale, we are left with images. The clatter of the axe, the roar of the fire, the terrified cries of a household undone in an instant. The solemn pronouncement of guilty in a courtroom already decided, the rope tightening around her neck. And then, silence. But in that silence, a pulse. A memory that refuses to die. A reminder that resistance, however desperate, however violent, is the shadow of oppression, and that wherever chains exist, flames wait quietly for air. Sarah of Kingston is not a comfortable figure. She is not meant to be. She is the sharp edge of history, the jagged reminder that freedom has always been won at a cost. Her story unsettles because it must. And perhaps that is her final legacy, to disturb our certainty, to force us to feel the weight of the past, to remind us that even in the darkest of times, even in the most hopeless of circumstances, there were those who chose fire over silence. The mansion she destroyed is gone. The city has grown, changed, modernized. But if you walk the streets of Kingston today and listen closely, you may still hear the echo of that Easter morning. You may feel it in the air, a whisper carried by the wind. One woman, one axe, one fire, and the empire trembled.